about hypothesis. What is hypothesis? Hypothesis states the problem of the research, the tentative solution. Hypothesis states the problems, research problems, tentative solution. It's an assumption or proposition that the researchers tries to find out. Then it is tested. Any kind of research requires two types of hypothesis. That means the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. These hypotheses are tested. While conducting a research, we need to draw two hypotheses. What are the hypotheses? Hypothesis means the tentative solution of the research. And how it is being tested? From the exam point of view, hypothesis can be divided into two parts. One is null hypothesis and the another one is alternative hypothesis. Okay, so first let's jump into a previous year question. That means, what is this particular topic? We can say the area in which the null hypothesis is not accepted is known as the region of rejection. And in 2023 it's given that acceptance of the null hypothesis when it should be rejected is known as type 1 error. Now, what is type 1 and what is type 2 error? As we can see that if a hypothesis, after testing a hypothesis, we can conclude two things. That means if the null hypothesis is rejected, when the hypothesis is right but the null hypothesis is rejected, then we call it type 1 error. RR1, WA2. WA means when the hypothesis is wrong but we accept it, it is known as type 2 or beta. Type 1 error, RR, hypothesis right but rejected, and type 2 error is WA, that means hypothesis wrong but accepted. So hypothesis can be divided into two parts, as I have discussed: alternative hypothesis and null hypothesis. Both the hypothesis, in alternative hypothesis we can say it's the relation between the variables and if the researcher accepts it, and null hypothesis states that there is no relation between variables and it tries to reject it. When the particular null hypothesis is rejected, in two situations null hypothesis gets rejected. Number one, when the hypothesis is right but the researcher rejects it, it's known as false positive. And in the second case, when the researcher accepts the hypothesis, accepts the wrong hypothesis. So the keyword is RR for type 1 for alpha error and WA for type 2 for beta error. And in alpha error we can say it's false positive, and in beta error we can say it's false negative. That means when we fail to reject a null hypothesis, that should be rejected. So we only test null hypothesis, and if it's not considered, then we move to alternative hypothesis. There are some other types of hypothesis as well: descriptive, relational, explanatory. Descriptive hypothesis states the formulated to describe the characteristics. Relational hypothesis just shows the relations and it describes it. Explanatory hypothesis also cause and effect relationship. It shows the cause and effect relationship. So hypothesis, as per NET and SET examination is concerned, hypothesis is a very important topic where it states the relationship of the research. It tests how the variables are being tested. It's a preposition, it's a tentative solution. We test the hypothesis before conducting our research, and after collecting all the data, then we identify the level of significance, whether my hypothesis is right or my hypothesis is wrong. Now, this note is based on previous year question of NTA UGC NET and SET. Sources of hypothesis. How do we gather knowledge about creating the hypothesis. We use or we craft hypothesis by creativity and experience. Our past experience helps us to create hypothesis. Background information and knowledge, literature review also helps us to create hypothesis. Versatile intellect or alert mind. That means the versatile, the intellect and alert mind uses us, helps us to create our hypothesis. Analogies. With different analogies, with different comparisons between one thing or the another, we create our hypothesis. These are the sources of hypothesis from where we are getting a particular hypothesis. And a systematic review. A researcher has to craft or draw both the hypothesis, alternative as well as null hypothesis. Now, as we have now known what is hypothesis, and from exam point of view, type 1 and type 2 hypothesis we have understood. Now we will be talking about the steps of hypothesis testing. How hypothesis is tested. Now we will be checking how hypothesis is tested. Whether my hypothesis is true or false, that is tested by a certain steps. First of all, we need to set up null and alternative hypothesis. The first step goes like setting up the null and alternative hypothesis. After setting up the null and alternative hypothesis, we make a level of significance or level of error wrong. I am predicting my hypothesis will be 99% correct. That means my level, my portion which I am considering, it might get wrong, some error might occur, that is 1%. And if my hypothesis states that I am 95% my research is all right, I am being the researcher, I am assuming, because hypothesis is crafted before conducting the research. So when my hypothesis, while crafting my hypothesis, I am, before conducting the research, I am setting a level of significance. It can be 1%, that means my confidence is more, that 99% chances are there that my hypothesis will be right. And always there lags a defect part, there lags something, is not everything will be under our control, right? So the moment we are setting our level of significance, it can be divided into two parts. One is 1% level of significance and another one is 5% level of significance. The moment we are telling about 5% level of significance, that means we are giving a room for 95% correct accuracy, and only 1%, the moment we are talking about 1%, it means 99% correct and 1% we are keeping a room for error. Now, while predicting future, we set the level of significance. After setting the level of significance, it can be 1% or 5% depending on my research, depending on my hypothesis. We decide which test to use. Now, not every research, we must know, research can be divided into many types. Broadly, research can be divided into qualitative and quantitative based on my data. Now, if my research is quantitative and qualitative both, then I will be using Z test, T test, F test, and that which is known as parametric test. After setting the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis, we set the level of significance. Then we decide what test to use, whether it is parametric test or non-parametric test. If it's non-parametric test, then we will be using chi-square test. So the steps are, first of all, we have to set the null and alternative hypothesis. For a researcher, it's mandatory to set null and alternative hypothesis, and only null hypothesis is being tested. Then comes the parametric and non-parametric part. Non-parametric, as I have discussed, only chi-square test. There are certain other tests as well, but this note is purely based on previous year question. These are the keyword based notes. And for parametric test, we have Z test, T test, F test. Now the question comes, when to use Z test, when to use T test, when to use F test. If the population is more than 30, then we will be using Z test. If my sample frame is less than 30, then we will be using T test. After that, we will find out the value. We will be finding out a computed value, that if my level of significance is 5%, then I am setting a computed value of accuracy 1.96. And if my value is level of significance is 1%, then I am setting a level 2.58. Now we have to take a decision. If my computed value is less than my actual calculated table value, then we accept the null hypothesis. And if my computed value is more than my table value, then we reject the null hypothesis. All right. And talking about the types of test, parametric test and non-parametric test. Parametric test, the types of parametric test are paired t-test, unpaired t-test, paired t-test, unpaired t-test, Pearson correlation, one-way analysis of variance, ANOVA test. And non-parametric test states that Wilcoxon rank sum test, Mann-Wuerning U test, Spearman correlation. Spearman correlation, non-parametric. Pearson correlation, parametric. That we have to learn, that we have to understand, because directly questions are being asked from this particular section. Now, information. In parametric, the information is completely known, and in non-parametric test, the information is completely unknown. Normal distribution, parametric test states a normal distribution curve or bell curve, and in non-parametric test, it's a non-normal distribution. The scale of parametric test is interval ratio. Interval and ratio, you have identified NOIR. In NOIRs, scale is interval and ratio, and nominal and ordinal for non-parametric. And that means nominal or ordinal states that it is qualitative or quantitative. Quantitative, no, it's qualitative, because we are judging the quality. If we are judging the quality, it's not dealing with numbers directly, so it's nominal and ordinal. The moment we are dealing with the parametric test, that means we are dealing with numbers. Numbers means quantity. And in parametric test, we use mean. Measure of central tendency is mean. Parametric measure of central tendency is calculated by mean. In non-parametric, measure of central tendency is calculated by median. Correlation testing is Pearson, that is t-test and z-test, and correlation testing in Spearman, that is chi-square test. It is also known as x-square. So this was it with today's rapid revision series. Today we have discussed about hypothesis. What is hypothesis we have discussed, and the types of hypothesis, type 1 and type 2 error, other types of hypothesis which we have already discussed, the sources from where we gather hypothesis, and the steps for hypothesis testing. Following with, we have learned about the types of test. Thank you for following at ISNO Media. Keep supporting.